Bonjour and welcome to the first part of our data models presentation for CIS 3107 Database Modeling. We will be covering data models, building blocks, and business rules from sections 2.1 through 2.4 in our textbook. In this first presentation, you will learn about data modeling, their importance, basic building blocks, and how business rules influence the design of a database. The data model is an iterative, progressive process. You start with a simple understanding of the problem domain, and as your understanding increases, so does the level of detail of the data model. A data model is a relatively simple representation, usually graphical, of more complex real-world data structures. In general terms, a model is an abstraction of a more complex real-world object or event. A model's main function is to help you understand the complexities of the real-world environment. Data models can facilitate interaction among the designer, the applications program, and the end user. A well-developed data model can even foster improved understanding of the organization for which the data design is developed. In short, data models are a communication tool that give an overall view of a database. They organize data for various users and are an abstraction for the creation of good databases. Keep in mind that a house blueprint is an abstraction. You cannot live in the blueprint. Similarly, the data model is an abstraction. You cannot draw the required data out of the data model. Just as you are not likely to build a good house without a blueprint, you are equally unlikely to create a good database without first creating an appropriate data model. The basic building blocks of all database models are entities, attributes, relationships, and constraints. An entity is a person, place, thing, or event about which data will be collected and stored. An attribute is a characteristic of an entity. For example, a customer entity would be described by attributes such as customer last name, customer first name, customer phone number, etc. Attributes are the equivalent of fields in a file system. A relationship describes an association among entities. Database models use three types of relationships: one-to-many, many-to-many, and one-to-one. Database designers usually use the shorthand notation 1:m, m:(n), and 1:1. A constraint is a restrictive place on the data. Constraints are important because they help to ensure data integrity. Constraints are normally expressed in the form of rules. To properly identify entities, attributes, relationships, and constraints is to clearly identify the business rules for the problem domain you are modeling. A business rule is a brief, precise, and unambiguous description of a policy, procedure, or principle within a specific organization's environment. These rules help define the basic building blocks of a data model, which in turn describes the main and distinguishing characteristics of the data. Business rules are derived from a description of operations. As its name implies, a description of operations is a detailed narrative that describes the operational environment of an organization. The main source of business rules are company managers, policymakers, department managers, and written documentation, such as a company's procedures, standards, and operational manuals. A faster and more direct source of business rules is direct interviews with end users. Unfortunately, because perceptions differ, end users are sometimes a less reliable source when it comes to specifying business rules. Identifying, documenting business rules is essential to database design, as the process helps to standardize the company's view of data and communication between users and designers. The process also helps designers to understand the nature, role, and scope of the data, as well as the overall business process. Furthermore, it allows the designers to develop appropriate relationship participation rules and constraints that create an accurate data model. Business rules set the stage for the proper identification of entities, attributes, relationships, and constraints. As a general rule, a noun in a business rule will translate into an entity in the model, and a verb, active or passive, associating nouns will translate into a relationship among the entities. For example, the business rule, quote, "a customer may generate many invoices," end quote, contains two nouns, customer and invoice, and a verb, quote, "generate," end quote, that associates them. During the translation of business rules to data model components, it is important to pay special attention to how you name the objects you are discovering. Entity names should be descriptive of the objects in the business environment and use terminology that is familiar to the users. An attribute name should also be descriptive of the data represented by that attribute. The use of a proper naming convention will improve the data model's ability to facilitate communication among the designer, application programmer, and the end user. In fact, a proper naming convention can go a long way toward making your model self-documenting. In this first lecture, we have discussed that a data model is an abstraction of a complex real-world data environment. Database designers use data models to communicate with programmers and end users. The basic data modeling components are entities, attributes, relationships, and constraints. Business rules are used to identify and define the basic modeling components within a specific real-world environment. Thank you for watching our Unit 2 Part 1 presentation. The diagrams and content of this lecture are derived from our textbook. For a more detailed treatment of these concepts, please review pages 35 to 41 in your textbook.